Okay, I think we're good then. Welcome, everyone. My pleasure to welcome Melanie Stansberry back to Cornell for what I expect is the first time since her election to the United States Congress. Congresswoman Stansberry won a landslide victory this past spring in a special House election to represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. Her campaign emphasized economic fairness and the urgency of addressing climate change. She now occupies the seat previously held by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. An environmental policy expert, Congresswoman Stansberry has dedicated her career to finding solutions to water issues, poverty, and climate change. Previously as a member of the New Mexico State Legislature and now in the US Congress. She's a champion of efforts to address hunger, food, water insecurity, conservation and climate change, economic development, and recovery. Prior to holding state and national elected office, Melanie Stansberry worked in communities across New Mexico as a STEM educator and a researcher on land and water issues. She also served as a former staffer for the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources in the White House Office of Management and Budget. And I'd be remiss if I failed to mention that Congresswoman Stansberry is also a Cornellian who did her graduate studies here in development sociology. Congresswoman Stansberry currently serves on 2 committees of considerable interest to many of us here in this room, the House Committee on Natural Resources and the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Thank you so much for joining us today to share your perspectives on leadership, governance, and strategies for advancing policies and actions for equitable development. Thanks very much.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me here today. Just a quick check, can everyone hear me well who's sitting in the classroom over there? All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon on the East Coast. I'm Melanie Stansberry, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am, as was said, not only Congresswoman for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, but also a Cornellian. I got my master's degree and technically I'm still ABD on my dissertation. I'm hoping to finish it one of these days. But I spent a number of years in Ithaca in the development sociology program. And part of why I was so honored and excited to join you all today after David and others and Tom, who are former faculty or current faculty who I had formerly studied under and worked with, is that much of the work that I worked on, the ideas that I studied while I was in the development sociology program, and the research that I did while I was a graduate student there have informed my career in public policy and as a public servant. And I thought it would be an awesome opportunity to share some of that with all of you today. So I just want to start by saying thank you all for inviting me. I'm really honored to participate in this colloquium. My first year at Cornell, I helped to put together, I think, the same series my first year in the department. And I'm excited to talk to you today about lessons learned and really bringing a justice and equity framework to government work. So I want to start today by telling you all a story. So I was a graduate student at Cornell, and I came home to New Mexico to do my dissertation research on land and water conflicts in northern New Mexico. And in 2010, while I was doing field research, I had the awesome opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. during the Obama administration and first intern in the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And then I got hired in the White House Office of Management and Budget and worked there for a number of years, and then ultimately worked in the US Senate as a water and science staffer in the Senate. And I was hired to work in the Senate by a senator named Maria Cantwell, who's the senator from Washington State. And one of the projects that she had asked me to work on was this huge bill to write a law to help support these communities who had been struggling for decades and really a century to come to an agreement over the sustainable and equitable management of water resources in a river watershed called the Yakima watershed, which is part of the overall Columbia River Basin in Washington. And this set of communities had been fighting over water for over a century. There are a number of tribes that have been there since time immemorial. They have treaty rights to use the fish that are in those rivers. Fish are integral to the culture of these tribes and their identities and their histories and their ways of life. And over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, those rivers and watersheds had been dammed and irrigation projects had been built. And that valley is now one of the most fertile valleys in Washington state. And in fact, if any of you partake in beer drinking, a lot of our hops are grown in the Yakima Valley, and a lot of our cherries and apples. But in the early 2000s, there had been a major climate study done by the US government in partnership with the state and the tribes and a bunch of different community groups. And what that climate study found is that over the next 50 to 100 years, those communities are going to be facing really dire consequences from the impacts of climate change on their water availability. And so these different stakeholders have come together and realized that if they didn't work together to address their common fate, they were going to be in really big trouble over climate change in the coming century. So they worked to put together this collaborative agreement, and it required action in Congress because it required federal resources and changes in some of the water rights allocations. So as a staffer, I was hired to come in and work with these stakeholders to write a bill. And we had only a few months to do it because of the congressional cycle. And we were working night and day on this bill. And long story short, over the next year and a half, we were working to get the bill through various committees, and these stakeholders would travel back and forth to Washington. And one day I was sitting at my desk in the summer of 2017 and my phone rang, and I was sitting in the Senate Hart building. And when I answered the phone, the director of an irrigation district in this whole watershed was completely breathless and started talking really fast because he had run like a quarter of a mile back to the phone to call me to tell me that for the first time in over 100 years, the first wild salmon had returned to their river. Now, I tell you this story because this story is really about the power of community-based policymaking and work. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't the bill that made this fish swim hundreds of miles up this river to come back to this community. It was the power of the collaboration that had happened inside of these communities as they were participating in this public process of trying to find a collaborative solution to their shared fate. And because everyone was sitting around the table for years, working, looking at the science, working to build collaborative frameworks, and looking for a way to find a common solution. That summer, the irrigation district, which had been fighting for many, many decades with other entities in the communities, had heard and listened to the tribes in the community who said that the return of these fish was not only integral, obviously, to the ecosystems, but to their cultures and way of life. And so the irrigation district on its own had gone and spent like $10,000 at Home Depot and installed a siphon pump to put water back into that stream. And wouldn't you know it, one summer, that one action, that one voluntary action of putting water back into that stream allowed the return of the first wild salmon in over a century. That is the power of collaborations. That is the power of social change. That is the power of ecological resilience in our communities. And I wanted to share this story with you because I think sometimes when we look at the tools of politics and government, we often think about them in terms of, politicians and their agendas and stakeholders and interest groups in a sort of academic way or in a very cynical way, because obviously we all participate in our political systems. But I want to talk today about really community-based politics and community-based policymaking, because that's where I believe that we can truly have an impact and change the world. So let's talk a little bit about what that exactly means. So as a congresswoman, as a civil servant, as a researcher, and as an activist, this is what I see as my fundamental work, which is to create spaces for communities to come in, to share their wisdom, to share their knowledge, to have a seat at the table and actually shape and create the public process to solve their problems. Because at the end of the day, that is why government exists. So, if we think about it in a very philosophical manner, the entire purpose of government as a human system is that governance systems exist to help our communities organize the way that they go about their business, organize their economies, and to help solve collective problems that our communities can't solve on their own. And here in the United States, of course, we have a governance system that is at once revolutionary in a way in its democratic ideals and the concepts, especially at the time that our Constitution were written, but that is also embedded in systems of social, racial, and economic injustice that have been written into our systems for centuries. And so when you view our governance systems through that lens, you see both the hope and the optimism and the opportunity to create systemic change, but also the reality that systemic inequality and lack of access to the system continue to make it difficult to actually make change. So our question as researchers, as students, as scholars, and as policymakers has to be, how do we help lead and use the tools of governance to bring true systemic change to our society? So I'm going to talk to you about 3 primary ways and share some anecdotes about my time in public service. So the first is electoral. Who leads matters. It matters because all of us carry inside of us our own lived experiences, our own identities, our own intersectionality of who we are and how we move in the world, and also our own priorities, the things that matter to us, the things that motivate our hearts to actually take action. So who leads, who represents us, and who sits in those seats of power really, really matters. And, unless you're a political science student or a scholar, oftentimes when we talk about policy, we don't talk about this most essential piece of the entire process, which is who leads. The second part I want to talk about is about what you do when you get there. So once you have people who are leading, who are in these positions of power, what they prioritize, what they put their hopes, passions, and dreams into, what they put resources into matters. And finally, the third piece is how do we open the process of governance and politics to our communities and to our people? And by that, I mean in a very radical way, how do we open the doors, not just break glass ceilings and get more representation around the table, but really at a deep root level say, how do we go to our communities and bring them to the table, open the doors of power, and let their voices help guide and lead on what actions we're going to take as we're trying to transform our governance systems. So first, let's talk about who leads. This is why I ran for office. I was just a nerdy sociologist before I decided to run for office and a staffer. I had worked, I was working on my dissertation, as I told you, and I had gone to Washington. And in reality, I thought my time in Washington would be a short stint. I initially went for 6 months and I ended up staying for 7 years. And as a staffer, I had the amazing opportunity to work on incredibly important policies. In the White House Office of Management and Budget, I worked on tribal issues, I worked on climate change, I worked on water and natural resources. And there is not a single day in that job where I didn't feel like the work that I was doing had impact and importance. And then when I went over to the Senate, I was literally working as a staffer, writing and negotiating bills and helping to create the public process through which our laws get made. But when the election happened in 2016, I was actually working as a staffer on the Hill. And I had this realization that fall, that if good people who care about our communities and who care about doing the work of our people don't run for office, then social change doesn't happen. And that's why I, like tens of thousands of people, ran for office in 2018. And one of my favorite statistics to give, which I think really illustrates the sort of epic watershed of the 2018 election and what that means for the electoral process, is the number of women who ran for office that year. So up until the 2018 election, the largest number of women who had ever sought assistance from a national organization called Emily's List, which helps women run for office, was around 900 to 1,000 women. In 2018, 42,000 women asked Emily's List for assistance to run for office. They ran for Congress, they ran for State House, they ran for city councilors, they ran for their municipal water boards, up and down every kind of seat across the country, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, people who had never even imagined that they could run for office, ran for office. And in the process, literally changed the fundamental fabric of our political system. I was elected to the State House in 2018 in a historic wave of women. And now we went from, in the New Mexico State House, from women being a minority of our legislature to now the majority of our House is actually women legislators. And that happened in 2 cycles. So who runs for office really, really matters. And I want to just take a moment to talk about how do you use the tools of social science and scholarship and the things that you all are learning about and studying right now to help do that. So I had studied at Cornell in development sociology, and part of why I had gone to Cornell is that I really wanted to learn about social movements and to really understand social systems and how do you create change. And so in 2017, when I moved home to New Mexico and I was asked to run for this seat in the most improbable election ever, I did the first thing that every good scientist should do, which is I looked at the data. And when I looked at the data for my House seat, what I saw is that the electoral trend was towards, I myself am a Democrat, being Democrats had started to perform better in this very Republican seat. And when I looked at the demographic and the census data for this district, I saw that there had been a progressive trend towards the community in which I live in. A much larger proportion of the demographics were people of color, low income, and working people. And we know from the voting data here in New Mexico that when people of color and low income people vote, they tend to vote for Democrats. So the data suggested that I had a potential chance. But there was nobody in the state at the time in the political establishment who thought that this seat was actually at play. And the thing that I just kept telling people over the course of our election is, have you looked at the data? Look at the data, because it's there in the data. But it's not enough just for the trends to be there. You have to actually put in the elbow grease and do the work. So I put to use all of the amazing social science that I had learned in the development sociology program. So the first thing we did was we assembled community leaders from across the community and literally did social mapping, just like you probably are learning in some of your social science classes. So we looked at what are the social institutions, what are the communities of faith, our local political leaders, other institutions and organizations that really have an impact in our communities. Who are the people whose voices really have an impact on others in the community? And we started to talk and have conversations, and we wrote a mission statement, and we worked collectively to really shape what it was that we were fighting for, because I believe strongly that if we were going to fight this fight, whether or not we won it, it needed to be time well spent. We needed to leave the community better than how we found it through our organizing, and that we had to organize around principles that really mattered. We had to build a race that people could believe in and that could really put their support behind. So we did that through our initial building. And then we went out using social network theory, which you are all probably learning about. And we went and contacted community leaders and built this massive community-based infrastructure. And we trained people to be community leaders very explicitly. We trained them in the tools of electoral politics, how to do organizing, how to do door knocking. And then we mobilized people on a massive scale. So in the 2018 election in my district, like I said, people thought this district could never be won statewide. There's 112 legislative districts. There were 70 House districts at play that year. And we were kind of like not even on the map in terms of a district in play. But people started to hear about the organizing that we were doing. And all of a sudden we started to get more campaign donations and people got really excited about what we were doing. And in the final weeks of our race, we had a campaign office in which literally hundreds of people were coming through our office every day, picking up packets to go knock doors, because not only had we built a campaign that we knew people could believe in, But our mission was bigger than just winning a seat. It was about transforming the community and empowering people that didn't already have a voice in the process. And so hundreds of people went out and knocked doors over and over and over again. And at the end of the day, even the night of the election, even as the polls were closing, people still thought, there's no way, we're not going to win this race. And when the polls closed, we were one of the first races called in the state of New Mexico, because not only did we win our race, we won it by 7 points in a district that had never been won before by a Democrat. And it wasn't about politics. It was about community organizing. It was about empowering people. It was about, telling people and encouraging them to get involved in the political process. So I think that this is such an important story and an important model because it was really based on good social science, good community organizing, and the way in which we got there really mattered. And that support not only helped to support me as I went into the State House and did my policy work, because many dozens of those people stayed engaged in the policy process, but in this last election cycle in 2020, as I was running for re-election, many of the swing seats around me either went back red or they were only won by like a 1 or 2% margin. And we doubled down and we held this seat by 10 points this last election cycle. And it wasn't about party affiliation, it was about our community. So that's the power of using community-based tools to really leverage political power to change who serves. So second, what you do when you get there matters. As I said, all of us have our own identities, our own passions, our own stories, the things that we carry with us. I grew up in New Mexico. I grew up in a working family, in a low income family that struggled often to make ends meet. My mom was a seamstress. My sister's dad, who helped raise me, owned a small landscaping company. My family worked hard every single day, some days, 7 days a week, and we still struggled to put food on the table. That lived experience is what has propelled my life's work in the field of social justice, because I believe at my fundamental core, because of my own lived experience, that in spite of the fact that I live in a state full of natural beauty and brilliance and creativity, there still is not enough opportunity structurally for our people to thrive. And that if we're going to actually do something about it, we have to actually change the rules of the system. And so that personal story, that personal motivation is what gets me out of bed every morning. That's the passion that I bring as the person who now sits in this seat. And in that case, sat in my State House seat. So what you do when you get there matters. And the policies that were really important to me when I got to the State House to prioritize is to really address these two conjoined issues that I had spent my entire career working on, which is poverty on one end of the spectrum and economic opportunity. So addressing things like homelessness and affordable housing and food security and equity in education and things like that, along with environmental sustainability, climate change, water, renewables, and all of that kind of stuff. So I want to give you 3 examples of what I did when I got there and how that work continues to inform what I do today now as a congressperson, but really to talk about how you use the tools of social science and social community building to really inform policy. So the 3 huge issues that I really took on during my time in the legislature were food security, water, and climate change. And in each of those areas, it was a passion that I brought. There were others who had been working on these issues in different kinds of ways, but these were the 3 things that I just felt so strongly that I could help make a difference in. So first, let's talk about food security. One of the reasons that I went to Cornell's development sociology program is that when I was an undergraduate, I had read a book by Phil McMichael about international food systems. And I wanted to learn to think about how our society operates in that kind of way. And so I came to Cornell to really understand how systems level thinking works, and then how do you apply that for social change. But I also grew up in a low income family and in a community where so many people struggle to put food on the table and are reliant on different social systems to help them survive every day. And so it was also personal for me. So when I got to the legislature, some of my colleagues had been working on food issues in different kinds of ways. But one of the missing elements that I saw is that people had not really put the pieces together to work on our food system as a whole. So we had a lot of organizations and advocates working on hunger issues on that side of the equation. And then we had farmers and trade associations and advocates and organizations working on food systems issues, advocating for improving our farming programs and things like that. But at the end of the day, right, hunger and our ability to feed our families depends on having a functional food system. So we started convening this huge work group. And when we first started, there were like 60 people. We got together at our local food bank, and there were members from the food bank and hunger and faith organizations, some scholars, and we just started having conversations. And I used my social science training to start doing focus group style explorations of, if we were to really take apart this challenge of New Mexico's food system, where are things broken and not working at a structural level? And how do we use the tools of public policy to help solve and bring interventions to help address that issue across the entire spectrum? Well, by the end of the year, we had developed a series of different legislative proposals. Some of them passed in the legislature, some of them didn't. And the following year, in March of 2020, the pandemic hit. And because at that point, there were now over 200, and within a week, over 500 different stakeholders across the state talking about our food system on a regular basis through a collaborative process. Our food policy working group became the nexus of emergency food aid during the COVID pandemic in the early days. And as a result of those partnerships and those collaborations, there were tons, literally tons of food and water moved around the state to make sure that communities had access to food and water during the early days of the pandemic. And one story in particular that I'll share with you all is that it was literally the only place where our farmers were at the same table as our food advocates and people who were helping to deliver food on the ground on a regular basis. We were on this call, it was before Zoom became super widespread and during the pandemic. And there were something like 250 people had hopped on this call. It was an emergency call to figure out how to move food around the state. And people had unmuted, there was like all this echoing happening. And finally, someone was able to unmute who was part of the Northern Navajo Agency, which is a part of the Navajo Nation, is a tribal nation in New Mexico, unmuted. And the woman got on the phone and she said, "We're having trouble getting food up here because of the disruption to the food chain." And this guy who is a farmer in central New Mexico, who is part of a, it's called the Agricultura Network, is a bunch of small local farmers, unmuted, and he said, "We have food, here's my phone number." And he gave his phone number, and 3 days later, thousands of pounds of food arrived in the Navajo Nation because of that connection. And it's just one instance, right? It's just one story. But I think that's the power of doing community-based work. Hundreds of families were able to eat that week because of that one connection. So sometimes your work changes the system, and sometimes your work helps a family for a day. And all of the work matters, right? All of it does. But you don't have those kinds of results unless you're doing community-based work. Ultimately, we introduced a big food systems bill this last legislative session, and the bill did not pass in its final form, but it passed as a budget initiative. And we were able to secure funding to institutionalize that working group as part of now the governor's work. And so that program that we started now exists as a formal state program. Second, water. Water is my lifelong passion. Water is life, water is sacred. Here in New Mexico, we say el agua es la vida. Water is life. It's part of the cultural fabric of who we are, our tribal communities, our historic, traditional Hispano communities, and for everyone here in our state, Water is so much a part of who we are. And yet it's such a scarce resource because we live in the high desert. And of all of the impacts of climate change, water is ground zero for those impacts. And we've been on a 30-year trajectory of seeing our water diminish from climate change and are in a drought crisis right now because of it. And one of the most fundamental things that's required to solve our water challenges, especially in light of climate change, is having information. And ironically, even though we live in a world that is completely immersed in information and data and real-time decision-making that literally you can access on your device in your hand right now. You know, I use this device to figure out where I'm going to go get coffee or how to get to a meeting or, you know, go shopping online. But we don't have water data available to help us make decisions, especially in real time as we're facing climate change. So in 2019, after I was elected, I started working on a water data bill. And similar to our experience working on food systems, we assembled a massive number of different stakeholders across the political spectrum. We ran it as a bipartisan bill, and our water data bill passed in the 2019 legislature with unanimous support in the House and the Senate and was signed into law by the governor a few months later, and is now literally held up as the model water data bill for the country. And that was just because that was a passion and my own knowledge that I brought to that work, along with this incredible collaboration, this bipartisan collaboration that we did. The final example I want to talk about is climate and the grid. As we all know, climate change is the issue of our time, along with social and racial injustice. And the magnitude of how you address climate change is both an economic challenge, a political challenge, and a chemistry challenge, right? How do we get carbon out of the atmosphere and prevent more from getting up there? And so every single session that I served in the state legislature, I carried climate legislation. And when I first came into the legislature in 2019, a number of members of my caucus were actually a little leery of carrying climate legislation because the administration and some of the kind of political discourse around climate change had been so chilling in the years leading up to that particular session. And, you know, I had just come back from Washington, where during the Obama administration, we had just, you know, signed on to the Paris Accords and had been doing all of this game-changing climate work. And so my first session, I carried a climate bill. It made it almost to the finish line, but we ran out of time. I carried this last session, literally the most comprehensive climate legislation ever introduced in our state legislature that brought together this huge coalition of social justice organizations and environmental organizations. Dozens of organizations worked on this legislation to try to address our carbon footprint, to provide resilience to our communities, and to address the social inequality impacts of climate transition, which is New Mexico is a fossil fuel state. Coal, oil, and gas are what fuel much of our economy and our state budget. And without an economic plan that's really embedded in our communities will suffer through this transition. And so we built a whole coalition to help come up with public policy ideas to help figure out how do we solve this huge, epic generational challenge. And ultimately, we were not able to get that bill passed, and that's a case study unto itself and for another time. But I think a lot of people probably understand the politics of that. But again, what was so powerful in that process was the coalitions that were built, the true coalitions, the trust building, and the support and the way in which the process unfolded between these different organizations. But I did manage last year to pass one piece of climate legislation, which is a grid modernization bill. And again, we use community-based practices in order to get that bill across the finish line. So New Mexico's electric grid, just like every electric grid in the country, is old, it needs to be rebuilt. And if we really want to see a clean energy revolution, we have to transform our grid to use the latest technology and telecommunications and to be able to manage the system in real time as wind and solar are coming on. A lot of people don't realize that the renewable energy revolution requires really fundamentally rewiring, literally, our infrastructure to make it possible. So we introduced a grid modernization bill. We worked with everyone. We worked with industry. We worked with utilities. We worked with fossil fuel. We worked with renewables. We worked with stakeholder groups. We worked with social justice groups. We worked with environmental groups, and we brought everyone around the table, said no idea is crazy. We're going to put everything out there and then see what makes sense through the end of it. And again, we were able to get bipartisan support. One of my Republican colleagues in the Senate was my primary co-sponsor in the Senate, and we passed that bill with unanimous support in the Senate, and it was signed into law by the governor. It was climate legislation. We passed climate legislation with bipartisan support. So, I tell you these stories for two reasons. One, to say what you do when you get there matters, and how you do the work matters. And when you use community-based practices, really extraordinary things are possible. I want to leave you guys kind of on the final note of how you do the work matters. And by that, I mean how you engage your communities. Again, I said at the beginning, part of why I came to Cornell is that I really wanted to learn how to do systems thinking and how to do community-based work. And that is the training that I got in the development sociology program. Oftentimes as scholars or as policymakers, we talk about, consulting with communities. We go, we talk to communities, we take the information back, and then we go back into wherever we're analyzing that information, and then we go take some action. Consultation is not the same thing as doing community-based work. I have tried since I left Cornell and was trained in community-based action research to really integrate those concepts into my work as a public servant, to say, how do you open up the process? How do you create tables where everyone is invited to the table, where communities themselves have the opportunity to identify what the challenges are, what their hopes and dreams and opportunities are, and then to actually craft the solutions themselves that we seek to use our governance tools to either put into the law or put into the budget or whatever, however we're going to use the tools of governance to bring social change. But to do that work takes a true commitment to communities and to empowering community voices. It's not the default, right? It's easy to hire a bunch of experts and then go write a bill and do your thing over here. But that doesn't necessarily result in any problem getting solved or a problem getting identified in a way that will actually have an impact that will benefit a community and address systemic inequality and social justice at the same time. So we have to create spaces in a very intentional way so that communities can be at the table. And that requires doing deep listening, oftentimes listening that's uncomfortable, because a lot of our communities who are disenfranchised, who haven't had a seat at the table, who are structurally disenfranchised in various different ways in our politics and in our economics, don't trust government. They don't trust institutions. They don't trust, that people who are coming into communities or coming to work with communities have the best intentions at heart. And so that work takes time. And oftentimes the political process and the policy process and the scholarship process doesn't align with the time that it requires to build trust and do deep listening. But you have to have that commitment to really do the work in that way. So since I've been a policymaker, one of the things that I've tried to do is to bring diverse groups of people together to create spaces where people can do deep listening with each other, where I can deep listen, and to actually go to communities, with communities, and listen in spaces and places where regular people are going about their lives and have ideas. Because our communities, all of our communities, are full of deep wisdom and deep knowledge and creativity and ideas that can change the world if you take the time to listen. So you have to do that work in a very explicit manner. I did that in the State House. Now, since I was elected in June 1st, here in my congressional district, we just wrapped up a huge listening tour. We went to 11 different communities. We've been meeting with tribal governments. We've been holding dozens and dozens of listening sessions and meetings to really listen to our communities and hear from our communities about what the challenges and opportunities are to bring social change. finally, you can't do this work unless you help give people tools to do the work. So one of the things that we realized is after my election in 2018, all these dozens of volunteers that had helped me get elected, many of them were scientists or social activists or homemakers, whatever, they spent their time doing, but they wanted to stay engaged in the public policy process itself. But they may not have been trained to be, legislative assistants or to write bills or to do research on different topics. And so one of the things that we did was create what I call community-based policy groups. So we stood up this sort of massive volunteer effort where we trained people, just regular citizens, to do research about policy. We trained them in bill writing, and we trained them in the political process so that they could participate in the legislative process itself. And some of the bills that I worked on, some of the bills that I sponsored, some of the bills that we passed were actually written by and with volunteers and people from our community who just brought their passion and good ideas to the process. So part of how you do community-based work is actually empower and bring tools to people. And I want to say that movement building is a multi-generational activity. You have to think about your work, right? Like we're working on solving the climate crisis right now. We're working on trying to solve systemic inequality and poverty in different places. And we will take and work as hard as we can during our time in office, our time as scholars, and during our lifetimes to do the work and take the work as far as we can. But this is a multi-generational activity. Doing social change is multi-generational. So part of the work that we also have to do is to build the next generation of change makers. And so the final piece is you have to invest in young people. And so another major piece of my work that's been community-based throughout my time in public office is in cultivating youth leadership and creating space and opportunities for interns and staff, not only to come and observe and participate in the process, but to self-actualize and get training and become leaders themselves, because people who are, teenagers now or college students right now who are just cutting their teeth in the craft of policymaking and social change, you all sitting in that classroom are the change makers of the future. You're going to go out and literally change the world in your generation. And so we need to make sure that we are giving you all of the tools and resources and inspiration to take your own talents to go do that work. So as I conclude my remarks here, I want to take you all back to that story that I started with, and that one little fish, that one little salmon who swam thousands of miles from the ocean, up the Columbia River, up the Yakima River, and up a tiny little mountain stream to go back to a place that was literally coded into its DNA over generations. And the return of that one fish and its cultural significance to the tribes in those communities, the significance in terms of the power of collaborations and community-based work, and the significance in terms of the resilience of nature and the ability for us to actually bring the change that we believe in, that we're fighting for, that we are all working so hard every day to make happen. It's only possible if you go forth and do the work. So my message to all of you is do work that matters, engage in policy and the policy process. And most importantly, if any of you have even the smallest little voice inside of you, go run for office. And with that, I want to thank you all for having me here today. And I just want to say, go change the world.
Thank you so much for that inspiring talk. We have about 5 minutes for questions. First question. Professor Mabaya will bring the microphone around.
I have a mic here, and I'll tell you 2 tips. Hold this as close to your mouth as you can.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering just if it's been hard to get other people that you're working with, other legislators, to understand the issues that are unique to New Mexico and your jurisdiction, because it seems that in terms of like climate and maybe even like cultural issues, indigenous issues, et cetera, that it could be challenging to sort of make other people understand those issues.
You know, I think that what I would say is that the more time I spend in public policy, the more I see that our experiences as humans and our fates are so similar across all of our communities. You know, the specifics and history of a particular community, its language, its cultures, its ideas are very unique to a place and a group of people. But the challenges of climate change, of social inequality, of the impacts of history and structural challenges within our communities are universals, I think, that are experienced across communities. And I think right now, because of especially that whole new generation of lawmakers who came in, particularly in the 2018 election in Congress and legislators, there's a whole new group of people serving in office who understand these issues at a very deep level and are fighting for these issues because it's very personal to them, including myself, right? And so I don't necessarily find it difficult at all. In fact, I find lots of partnership and allies. But what I would say is there's such a tremendous power in storytelling because our human minds are so, wired for it. And the best way to, I think, help leverage policy work is to tell stories. I often tell my staff and people that I work with, you can inform the mind, but you have to touch the heart to motivate action. And that's the power of stories. And so one of the things I encourage people who want to get into the public policy realm is really cultivate your storytelling and figure out how to take your passions and your dreams and really translate those into powerful stories that are backed by good data and knowledge about how the system works.
We have another question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm wondering, you talked about deep listening and how do you get to the point of even opening up that deep listening, especially in communities that have a distrust of institutions? How do you convince people that this time it's actually worth their time?
I don't ever approach listening as an activity that involves convincing. I believe that your job, if you are there to listen, is just to show up. And if people want to talk to you, your job is to sit and listen and to tell people that you hear them and to ensure that you take the knowledge that they've shared with you and the ideas that they've shared with you with respect and collaboration and partnership and build something out of it. Because part of deep listening is taking action. It's not a passive activity. It's taking the information and the sharing and then building something together. If you go into a community or you're trying to work with a community with the intention of sort of like convincing them that they need to trust you or work with you, I think that the approach itself is the wrong approach. You have to, I think, approach the activity itself with the open heart that it may not go as planned at all. In fact, when I came home to New Mexico to work on my dissertation research, I was deeply committed to doing participatory action research. It took me 8 or 9 months of showing up over and over and over again before it became clear that the agenda I thought I had for doing my research wasn't really of very much interest to the organizations and people that I wanted to work with. And I had to accept that because I was committed to action research. So I think, it's really about the heart that you bring to the work. And the deep listening is just showing up and then taking action and demonstrating over and over again that you show up and you take action.
The next question is coming from somebody online. Tom Deschel, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question from online.
Sure, I will. Thank you. Can you hear me, Ed?
We hear you loud and clear.
Hi, Melanie. It's so good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And thank you for your attention and energy and inspiration. I just have a question. When I try to follow, I haven't been able to follow the kinds of things that you're doing, even though we maybe have some connections. I have some family in your district. But when I look at Congress and politics, I mainly see partisanship and, not necessarily intelligent exchanges between people. This is one way to say that. But the kind of stories you're telling, I don't hear them when I try to get information about how is it that we could have the kind of dialogue that you're in. How could we feature this in some kind of general way so that people could get access to it? I feel like the story you're telling is really important, but that's not what people think of when they think of state politics or federal politics. Is that clear, my question?
Yeah. I think
Okay.
it's such an important question. And I actually get asked about this every single day by people on both sides of the aisle, which is that I think that the American public is, in a way, especially after, all of the collective experiences we've had over the last several years, sort of traumatized by the partisanship and breakdown in our democratic institutions and yearning for signs that it's all going to be okay and that we have good leaders that are working together who are actually working towards the common good. And that's part of why I like to share these kinds of stories, because there's so much of this work actually happening for real inside our state houses and inside the Capitol. I think that what has happened is that the public discourse is really drowned out by cable news in a large part, right? Because it is crafted to be a channel through which partisanship messages are just propagated into our society, and by social media, which is, continues to perpetuate and even create social division through the way that it puts information into the world. That's why I actually think it's so important that we use different institutional and cultural spaces to tell these kinds of stories. So I think that, Cornell as an institution could convene, a series on bipartisan lawmaking, or could, feature different kinds of inspiring stories. But I think a lot of it has to do with the media environment, because when there is a lot of partisanship, don't get me wrong, there are politicians who appear to go about their work in a way that appears to, be focused on the spotlight rather than the work itself. But behind all those people, which are frankly in the minority, there are hundreds of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who are just quietly going about their work and serving the people. You don't go into public service if you don't care about our communities. And so I think creating spaces where we can tell those stories is really important.
Okay, thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. Can I squeeze one more question?
Sure, of course.
My name is Ed Mabaya, and I think you're really touching on things that are very important to people globally. But a lot of these issues, such as climate change, are important but not very popular because they require global thinking and they're not always relevant to local people, not immediately. How do you galvanize support for such issues that require global action to galvanize that support locally?
Well, that's such a complex question, and that's why we need people who are trained in systems thinking. So I'll go back to what I said a few moments ago about climate change. When you break down the climate crisis and the challenge of it, it's science, it's politics, and it's economics. Over the last 100 years, we built a global economy that depended on fossil fuels to fuel it, from our electricity generation to vehicles to, every form of energy. And that's just the history of our world system. That is the sources of energy that we discovered in the late 19th century. And around the middle of this century, we discovered, by doing that, we put all this pollution into the atmosphere that is changing the entire system. But because our entire economic system is completely built on this system, this global economic system, the challenge is so vast in its scope. And so, I think that part of the challenge is to figure out, what are the most impactful things at this moment as we are trying to avert passing another climate threshold, because we've already passed some significant temperature and carbon thresholds, what we can do. So that's why, global agreements like the Paris Accords are critical. That's why federal legislation that curbs carbon emissions is critical. That's why state and local carbon emission standards are so critical, because it's a collective action problem. Social scientists are actually the best suited to help solve these problems, because really at its core, climate change is a social action problem, right? So figuring out how do you mobilize countries at a national scale and then communities at an international scale to take action is really how do we mobilize global collective action? And then within each of those systems, right? What are the politics that are preventing that? What are the economic systems and interests that are preventing that? And working, to work through them. So here in New Mexico, the climate bill that we worked on this last spring, we actually were very thoughtful about how we approached industry and tried to work with industry to address these issues. And what I learned in that process, because I met with many oil and gas companies over the process, is that they're already doing this in California. So they have the know-how, they know how to do it, but they also have a lot of power inside my state. And so, if they could move the political system, they would move the political system. So I think part of the work that we're doing is not also just sort of like figuring out the puzzle of collective action and figuring out where the lever points are. But at the end of the day, it's also about movement building. It's about saying, our communities are standing up and saying, our entire global system is threatened right now by this crisis. We have to take action now. And that's why you need social movements to push leaders to take action. It's not enough to just make changes around the edges. So you have to work these systems across all of the different articulations.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Okay, thanks again. Let's give another hand to Congresswoman